Hello, welcome back. All right, so recently there was a trailer drop for a new Super Mario movie, and I like me some animation. Yeah, just kind of wanted to go through the process of how I would create some totally procedurally generated bricks. You don't even have to like UV map anything or do textures in a different program. It's going to be 100% here inside Houdini. So if you're interested in something like this, here we go. Okay, so basically what I wanted to start with is I'm going to create a node here and just call it create bricks. A lot of times I also like to create another node. I just type in Tommy. It's this Houdini test geometry node, and it's really nice because it helps me just have a reference on scale and what size I want my brick to be. So I'm going to jump in here, and if he disappears, since we're inside this network, we can just click up here and ghost other objects. So he kind of stays there as a reference. So what I'm going to do is drop down a box, and right now the way I have Houdini set up here, my window viewport layout's a little bit different, so I'm just going to hit P there, but you can follow along just the same. And so the size of a brick, roughly, I think I looked it up, was about 0.275 by 0.075, I think, and 0.1. Let's see. Yeah, that seems about right. Maybe we could make it just a tad fatter there. Okay. You can look up exact dimensions, but that's basically about the size of brick that I wanted to create here. And so now I'm just going to drop down a tube. And I'm going to drop down a merge node as well, just to kind of visualize this. Going to make it much smaller here. Change the height here. Let's make this about 0.05. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut some holes in this. I'm going to change the columns here to 64 just so we have a rounder tube. And then what I'm going to do is drop down a transform node and plug it in here to my merge. And I'm just going to middle mouse click so you can pull up these and then slide over just to kind of get that. So let's do 0.08. And if I hold down Alt and click on this node, and drag it over, then it will duplicate there. And so I'll do a -0.8, so it's kind of exact. And if I hold down Y, a scissors icon comes up here over these nodes, and I can just hold down my mouse and click, and it disconnects that there. So this will just kind of be my cutter object for this basic brick box. So I'll drop down a Boolean node and we will plug it in right here. So there we go. We have our basic, shape of a brick. And what I want to do is basically make this a high resolution mesh, so then I can kind of add some noises, disrupt it a little bit, and give us a nice organic feel, kind of like what we were getting here with our bricks. Now I'm redoing this, so it may not look exactly like these ones do, but we're gonna just go through the same kind of process of creating these bricks. So what I'm gonna do is drop down a VDB from polygons node. And what this does is it takes this geometry, which is watertight, and it converts it to a VDB. Now I'm gonna make the voxel size smaller, so then we get a higher resolution mesh. Maybe I'll just drop it down to 0.001. And then with any brick, it's probably going to have smoother edges. We started this with this perfect geometry. So what I'm going to do is drop down a VDB smooth. And what that'll do is kind of just smooth out all the edges. These bevels and stuff exist in real life. Typically, almost nothing is like the straight edge. And so you really want to like smooth out almost everything. So what I'm going to do is maybe up the iterations to 8. And then I can drop down a VDB convert. If I plug this in here, what we can do is convert this to polygons. And so right away we have a very high resolution mesh. I'm going to turn off this ghost now that we kind of see that this brick is kind of the right size that we want it, so we don't really need that reference anymore. And so now what I can do, this brick is like a perfect non-organic looking brick right now, but what we can do is drop down a node called a mountain node, plug it in here, and what this mountain node does is it has this 3D noise that it basically displaces the geometry based on its resolution. And so since we have a lot of polygons here, we get this high resolution displacement here, but obviously this is way too much. So what we could do is just turn down the amplitude for a sec. Maybe we put it back up there, and then let's just again middle mouse click and kind of decrease the size so we start to see how this is kind of affecting the brick. But maybe we want it even smaller, and then an even smaller amplitude, because what we're really going for is just something to disrupt, not make it, you know, this is perfectly clean, and we want a little bit of noise to kind of disrupt things so it feels more real. And so typically bricks, you know, they're pretty rough, made up of all these different types of materials, so I think that's fine. And what I could also do is this is kind of like a perfect new brick right out of the factory. Maybe I'll go back up to my smoothing and put it up to 16 iterations, or maybe even 32, just so we get smoother edges here. And the great thing about Houdini is all these nodes will update procedurally. So now that we kind of have this mountain here, what I'm going to do is drop down a labs, Houdini labs node. And there's one called edge damage that basically just analyzes the edges of this geometry, and it kind of creates damage in it. And on this node, I'm going to use the VDB method, because what it's going to do essentially is take this, convert it to a VDB, and then do all of its processing and convert it back, something like that. I don't know exactly what it does, but that's the method I'm going to use. Yeah, let me just save this real quick as brick v01. I just hit Command S to do that. So now let's add some edge damage to this brick. What we're essentially going to do is create 3 different types of bricks that all have different types of damage. One being really damaged, one being partially damaged, and one being none. So we see right here off the bat that we don't really get what we want. We don't get any damage because the voxel method here, the voxel size was actually a little too big. Originally, our voxel size here was about 0.001. So what we can do is just increase that voxel size here on the edge damage. And look, we now have this nice amount of decay and damage as if this brick had been kind of tossed around or just chipped over time. We can even increase that mount. I could, you know, increase that to 6. So now we get a brick that's really kind of eaten away. Maybe that's a little too much. So maybe we'll just put it to 4. Okay. And yeah, I think if we play with this noise here, I think that'll probably adjust exactly what's how much edge damage happens. And so maybe if we turn that up to maybe 2, it'll be a little bit like less chaotic, but I kind of liked it a little less there, so maybe that works. Okay, cool. So this will be our brick full damage. Okay. And the nice thing again about Houdini is we can just kind of proceduralize this, so just change the nodes that we want to change. So what I'm going to do is select these and then hold down Alt, drag over here just to kind of duplicate the setup. And it'll take just a sec to remesh everything because it's running the node. Okay, so what I could do is maybe just change the offset on this noise so we get like a varied noise here initially. And then I'm just going to hit manual here so it doesn't run this. And then from here, what we could do for the edge damage, what we want to do is, I turned that back to update, by the way. Guess didn't really need to do it. What we're going to do is try and not have as much damage, but we still want some damage. So maybe we'll turn the amount down to 2. Yeah, maybe 2 is fine. And then maybe the height, maybe we change that to 0.5. It's not what I was going for. 0.5, maybe the element size to 0.25. No. Again, sometimes I just play around with these values because I don't know who exactly set this up from Houdini. I mean, they did a great job. I just, kind of play around just to get kind of the look that I was going for, and that's not what I was going for. So let's just reference that. Notes of 0.4 and 1. Let's just do that. And then, yeah, let's do 2.5 as our amount of damage. So we see this is it's loading again. This is full damage. And then this is maybe partial damage. Again, you could adjust these and make it better, but for the sake of time, it's just to kind of show you a variation. And then what we could do right here is we will just do a brick with no damage. Okay, so now we have 3 different types of bricks. And now from here, what we can do is let's just hone in on bringing a texture to this. Now, it's a really high resolution mesh. This isn't crazy efficient for, if you're going to be doing a whole wall of bricks, obviously, but there are some optimizations that we can utilize here in Houdini. So just be aware that, if you had something like this, you'd probably want to retopologize it. I'm not going to right now because I kind of wanted to show you how you could do this, how you could texture everything inside Houdini really quick and not have to worry about keeping track of UV maps. Funny enough, though, we are going to use a slight UV mapping method in order to do this. So here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to drop down another null and plug this in because this is like the start of our texturing. Okay. And what I'm going to do, basically, I'm going to grab a texture that's for free online that's kind of like a plaster brick texture that will work for this surface. And you can go to a website called polyhaven.com. And it's a really great website for different textures and HDRI maps, and it's completely free. Obviously, you could support by donating as well. But I just grabbed the rough plaster brick number 4 texture. You can go there, download it for free. That's what I'm going to be using. So what I'm going to do is drop down a box node. And if I plug it in here, what that box node will do is it'll automatically wrap around the size of this original brick object. And so what I'm going to do is try and make this box, by changing the divisions, try and make it optimized where we can get a decent amount of quads that kind of will subdivide nicely. So basically we just want them as close to square shapes as possible. So yeah, that looks good right there. And what I'm going to do is drop down a UV unwrap. What this node does is it's going to UV wrap this box, and because it's a box, it's like set up on 6 planes. If I hover in my viewport and hold down press space 5, we can see our UV map right here. I'll drop down a UV layout as well, just to kind of get a bigger layout there. Spacebar 1 to go back to your normal view. So this has been UV mapped, and what we want to do is subdivide this in order to make this mesh a lot higher resolution. And then we're going to actually apply a UV texture to this and then sample it from our other geometry. So let me show you what I mean. So we have this ray node, and what it does is it takes in a geometry, and you can basically array this mesh to any other mesh as a collision primitive. So I'm going to turn off the show geometry guide, hit W there, and I'm going to change the method to minimum distance, so it kind of snaps to this high resolution texture that we had. But you'll see that it starts to conform to the shape, and as we increase the subdivisions, I'm going to turn on override crease weight and just crank that all the way up, so this maintains a square shape as we subdivide. But if I start to ray to this object, we start to see that it starts to conform a lot more to the 6+6 to the shape of the actual brick that we had here. But this one doesn't have UVs. This one does. It obviously doesn't have those holes. So in the future, you could use like an optimized UV mapped brick and use textures and everything, go this route. I'm actually not going to use this. This is just kind of a utility because I'm going to drop down an attribute map. And what this does is this reads in a UV texture, and then it applies the color of that UV texture to the actual point values in Houdini. So that's why I made this mesh really high resolution, because then all the color from the UV map, since this is a UV mapped object, will then basically sample itself to the mesh here. And then we can transfer those colors to this other mesh that we've been building. So what I'm going to do first is drop down. I'd already downloaded the texture, like I said, from Polyhaven. And in my inputs, I'm going to drop in the diffuse map. Okay, so right away. Okay, well, anyway, I think if we just drop down another node here, we're going to take this in as the color. Okay. And what I'm going to do is basically transfer attributes here. Okay, so we'll start with color, basically the diffuse. So I'm going to plug this into the third input here. And I'm going to use some vex right here. So if you're unfamiliar with the vex, it's okay. You can just follow along. And these types of things, when you follow along, learn another vex function. These are really helpful for later on because it'll kind of solidify how to use these things. So what I want to do is essentially from this mesh that we have here, this high resolution mesh, each point on it, if I toggle points, each point we basically want to iterate over and have it reference, have it basically look up where its closest point is here on this mesh, and then grab the color value. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to subdivide that 7 times so we get even a higher resolution color attribute coming in here from that texture, because that texture is going to make it so much easier that we don't have to use a bunch of procedurally generated noises or anything. Right off the bat, we're just getting a nice plaster brickish texture. So I'm going to type int excuse me, int prim semicolon vector uvw, and I'm going to use a function called xyz dist, and this is the function that basically takes our standard geometry right now. So I'm going to use the 0 input. I'm going to reference at P, which is the position of every point of this mesh here, and then I'm going to pass in this empty prim value and this empty uvw value. And what it's going to do is it's actually going to return, we're not going to return anything here. Normally it does return a distance attribute. We don't need that, so I'm just going to erase it. But what it does after it runs this line of code is it tells us, hey, it tells us a prim number from this geometry and a UVW value for that prim polygon. Basically, long story short, it's just, telling us the exact location, the sampled location relative to these points. And so what I can do is grab, make a vector let's call it color, and that's equal to, now here's the sampling part of it. We're going to use a function called primuv, and this is actually going to grab from the third input, which is right here. We are going to grab the CD, which is the color attribute that we have here on this mesh here. If I middle mouse click here, oh, went away. There we go. We have the CD attribute that I want to grab. So that's why I typed in CD here. And then I'm going to say whatever prim num we are closest to and the UVW value on that prim number, let's grab that. Nothing's happened because I haven't actually added a color attribute here on this mesh, this incoming pipe. So what I could do is just say at CD, my color is equal to this color that I just grabbed. And now we see it, it paints that texture onto this brick here. Okay, but for some reason it's not quite looking as I intended. So why don't we go here to this where we're creating it, and see it's not quite grabbing it. Oh, what I'm doing is on my XYZ dist function, I actually need to reference this geometry. Okay, there we go. And then it pulls all of this this data that we wanted. So now we don't have to spend any time texturing our brick. It's already there written into the mesh. There's no UVs, no anything. We're just using it as a color attribute. I could even drop down a subdivide right before here. So that will just beef up our resolution. Makes this heavier, but now we see we have even crisper resolution here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is in here, I just hit W, but that pulls up the wireframe. I don't even know. Okay, so this attribute from map settings, what we could do also is we can kind of scale this. Maybe I'll scale it to 0.5, you know, kind of depending on how we want to reference the map. And maybe that looks like enough texture for our brick here. Okay, so I'll leave that as is, and I'm going to hold down Alt, click and drag, and we're also going to grab a normals map. So if I grab here the normals, we're going to take that in as a color, but I'm going to export the attribute as normals. So now this way, when we sample the color here, let's just make sure that that's not reading in as it shouldn't be reading in, it shouldn't be overriding the color. Let's see here. Should we turn off visualize? Okay, there we go. Yeah, that was kind of a little bit of a bug there, I think. We were just visualizing that attribute, but yeah, we see we only have our color that we're still grabbing. So now vector normals, I'm going to do the same thing. And since we already got the prim and the UVW value, I'm again just going to use the same function primuv from the third input and just grab the normals attribute, prim UVW. And I'm going to write this out as v at norm. We'll just call it norm. Okay, so now right here we see we have the color and the norm. Just to make sure that that's working, I'm going to drop down a point bop. You could do this in Vex. I'm just going to do it here as a displace. What I'm going to do is drop down a bind. This basically imports any attributes, and the attribute I want to import is norm. Change that to vector. And what I'm going to do is drop down a displace, and I'm going to plug in the position here, plug in the normal, and then plug in the new position as it's displacing from that normal. The thing is though, when we read this in, this is a tangent space normal. If I visualize it here. And so it's read in from a value from 0 to 1, but normals should be -1 to 1. So we'll drop down a fit range. We'll plug that in here and we'll refit that from 0 to 1 to -1. Okay, so now that should displace things properly. I'll do like 0.01 displace. I'll come back out here. I pressed U to jump out of there. And I'm going to just drop down a normals node here, just so we can see better how it's doing. So we see there's just, if I bypass this, look at the difference of detail that we get again. And this is all just kind of like adding just a little bit of texture here, maybe 0.2. You can see how that looks. No, that's a little too much. 0.1's fine. Maybe we'll just do a scale there. Okay. So now we added kind of more of a sandstone-y texture that would happen in a roughed up brick like this. We get a lot more detail right here as opposed to this smoother looking brick. And lastly, what I want to do is I actually want to pull in some of the specular from here. So what we'll do is call that spec. And I can pull in the specular map here as well. It's called the roughness here. So I will import that as spec. And let's import it as a float. So if I middle mouse click here, we see that we have spec coming in. And again, one last transfer here. I'll just copy all this, paste it here. Instead of grabbing a vector, we're going to grab a float specular. And we're going to grab the attribute that was named spec. And we will create a new attribute, f at spec equals this specular float attribute that I sampled. Redundant here, I could have just said f at spec is equal to this function, but oh well. If we want to visualize, make sure we have spec. I can click on this I here and then click on spec. And if you don't see anything change, make sure that this visualizing tab is clicked on. So we see that it's taking in the specular values and whatever it's ramping from a 0 to 1 value. So blue is 0 and all the way up to red is 1 and white's kind of in between. So that gives us some nice texture that we can use when we actually render our brick. This is displacing here. And so I think we are ready to take these and start rendering. But we got to apply the same setup to our other bricks. So done texturing. I'm just going to select these all, kind of clean it up there. And if I hold down Alt click again on this whole setup, we can change that there. And again, a lot of creating like these procedural setups in Houdini, you always want to kind of vary things. And so if I copy this setup, one thing that I want to change now is I want to change the kind of the UV projection of this map on here. So then this brick, even though it's different destruction on this one, it's the same texture look, and we don't want that. We want to vary it up. And so I'm going to click this to manual so it doesn't recook everything. And basically I'm just going to rotate this by 90 degrees on all these nodes because we have to read in the UVs for these 3 separate passes all the same. So I'll rotate them all by 90 and let's update that. So now we see we have a little bit different looking of a brick. It's got different texture and that's fine. Maybe you'd want to change it if there's some spots where you're like, that looks kind of funny. That would be just fine. But for our purposes, I'm just going to leave it here, duplicate this last one. And this is kind of like the no damage brick. And here, again, I'm just going to maybe change the scale to like 0.6. Maybe I'll rotate it by 45. Maybe I'll, no, let's not translate that. But maybe that's fine. 0.6, 45, and then 0.6 and 45. So now we have a different texture here, here, and here. Okay, so brick out 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so we have now successfully created our bricks. If you middle mouse click, they all have a color, and we're going to be using the specular. We don't actually need that normals attribute anymore, or this norm attribute, because we already displaced. That being said, we'll take these now and let's apply a material to them. So I'm going to jump out here. I'll just turn these nodes off. What I like to do is create a separate node for rendering. So I'll caps render brick 0, 1, and I'll dive inside here, drop down an object merge. I will ... slash ... slash, because this is kind of like a file structure. That's how Houdini works. Go to create bricks, and then brick out 1 is the one I'll grab here. Middle mouse, sorry, not middle mouse, hold down Alt, drag here. This is our brick 2. And just in this object space, I'll translate this up by 0.1. So we see our 2 separate bricks. And then let's get the last one. And I'll put this up by 0.2. Okay. So let's create a material. So I'm going to drop down a material network right here. Matte, let's call it that. And a quick tip is if you hold, like have my mouse here in this window pane, if I hold down Control and hit 1, it saves it as a quick mark. So it's really handy to jump back and forth between different things with a quick mark. I'll jump in here to my material. I'll drop down a principal shader, and I'll name it brick. We are going to be rendering in Mantra. So I'm going to hit Control 2. So that's a quick mark. So now if I just click 1 in here, it jumps back here. If I click 2, it jumps back there. Okay, so I'm going to do 1, and here I'm going to just click on the matte brick shader. I'm going to grab that, copy that, paste it here, and paste it here. And then I'm just going to drop down an environment light just to kind of start things off for this brick. Last thing we need is a camera. If I'm here in my viewport, I'm just going to hold down Control and click camera. So then it kind of makes a camera there. In my camera settings, I'm just going to change this to 1080 by 1080. And maybe a 70mm camera. If I want to center this on here, I can just select these 3 objects and hit space G. Yeah, sometimes it's like just memory that I do these things. Space G. Okay, so now we're ready to kind of just do a little bit of look dev, make sure we can tune our shader, and then we'd be good to render. So I'm going to up here click on this object network and go to the out network, and I'll drop down a mantra node. And what I'll do is hit Control 3. So now we have a quick mark. So 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3. Back here, yeah, we're just going to render this object here. So now that we have that, I can go to my render view, select the camera. We've got the mantra node, and hit render. So it'll take just a sec to load up. Okay, so right off the bat, we're getting a pretty good result. We see some of our color attribute getting read in. However, the glossiness of these bricks is all the same. That's exactly why we stole that specular attribute, because we're going to apply that. So let's just take a snapshot here to see where it's at just right off the bat. And what I'm going to do is I want to import that specular attribute. And to do that into a shader here, what I can do is drop down bind. And I'm going to name this spec because that's the attribute we want to import. And since it's on the mesh, it will grab it. I'm going to plug this into the roughness. We see it's going to update it. I'm going to save while we're at it. Control S. Always save because sometimes it could crash, especially when you're doing this. Now, this is great because now we're getting the specular that we kind of wanted. The problem is now our color is gone, and that's because I think when you plug things in here, then it's like, we're just gonna assume that things are getting plugged in here, and so we're not going to pull the color attribute that was on our mesh. So we can just drop down another bind and click that to just a vector, name it CD because that was the name of our color attribute, and plug it into the base color. And then now we don't have to worry about that. So now we have our base color there, our specular. And this isn't looking the best because we just have that dome light. So what I'm going to do now is pause that, go back to my scene, hit 1 there. I'm going to get rid of the environment light, and I'm just going to drop down like a back area light. If I hold down Control and hit area, then it'll kind of update that as is. So now if I jump back to my render view, getting a little bit better of like a mood light. So we've got that. Maybe I'll just do a kiss of a key. Control A. That's going to be too bright, but no, that works. That's fine. So now what we can do back here, I can drop down a ramp parameter. And basically switch this to a spline ramp, and I can kind of remap the specular however I want these bricks to look. But the nice thing is if I unplug this, again, remember when you unplug this, then it all is the same glossy value, but plugging in the roughness, or now that it's reading in the spec, you can kind of fine tune this. We see we've got this this roughness here, and then it's more smooth on these areas. We could even invert that, kind of just tweak it however you'd like. We're essentially just remapping the specular. So something like that is kind of feeling more natural, where not all the parts of the brick are totally like rough, but not all are smooth. And even down here, maybe I'll make sure the value is always at the lowest 0.2, and maybe 0.9 is the roughest it gets. So then we have these bricks here. And lastly, if you wanted to kind of change the hue of this, you could drop down a color correction, plug this in here, and maybe -0.03 changes it closer to red. Purple, you could kind of go crazy, up the saturation. Maybe you want some more reddish of a brick. There we go. That's more orange. Whatever floats your boat. But again, that basically about does it. Obviously, you could animate these in a different way that you want, but the nice thing is now we have 3 separate procedurally generated bricks, have this really quick texture. They don't have any UVs. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It's just kind of all baked in. Now again, they are high-res meshes. It's not going to be super efficient to duplicate these. These are probably close to 1 million polygons, but it was quick, it was fast, it was all done in Houdini, and you don't need to jump to any other programs in order to get this done. And again, if you want to change out the texture, you can totally do that. This was kind of my approach to just quickly coming up with a brick texture, because if I pause this here and we, select our camera and we come back way out here, I'll update it. We see the farther we get away, especially, it just starts to look like grungy bricks. And you could totally change this up. You can make 10 variations on a damaged brick and cleaner bricks, and even do different textures and all this crazy stuff in order to make a really varied set amount of bricks. So I'm not going to go through the process of rendering out a whole video, but that's just the basics of what I would do in order to start to finish, get something going, get a brick going. So hopefully this is helpful for you guys, and we'll see you next time.